I'm going to read The Silver Scream from Lump It or Leave It by Florence King. Florence King was born in 1936 and died in 2016. Lump It or Leave It was first published in 1990. This material is okay to be listened to by children. The Silver Scream. As one born in 1936, I am a member of America's most movie-influenced generation, raised on the great films of Hollywood's golden age. Children of the 30s and 40s went to the movies every time the picture changed, which was 2 or 3 times a week. In that era of non-working mothers and live-in grandmothers, I would get home from school to find Mama and Granny ready and waiting for our afternoon treat at the Tivoli, our neighborhood theater at 14th and Park Road. We never paid any attention to the schedule. The idea was to go to the movies right after school let out, so we would be home in time for dinner. If we happened to arrive when the picture was starting, fine. If not, that was fine too. More often than not, we got in at the middle just in time to see Marion Hopkins burst into tears or Betty Davis shoot somebody, without having the faintest idea why. We watched from the middle to the end, then saw the selected short subjects, then the previews of coming attractions, and finally, when the next continuous showing started, we saw the beginning. Seeing movies backwards was not merely our family eccentricity, but a national practice. The catchphrase, "This is where I came in," originated at this time, though with 3 mindsets to deal with, we never could agree on when that was. Granny, a Victorian, remembered deathbed scenes. Mama, an unregenerate tomboy, noticed fights and cars. And I was in the animal-loving stage when children want to grow up to be veterinarians. We got here when she fell off the horse. No, we didn't see her fall off. We just heard the doctor say she was paralyzed for life while we were buying popcorn. George Raft was beating somebody up when we sat down. Oh, look, there's Charles Coburn with his head in his hands. That's where we came in. If it wasn't too late, remaining to see a favorite scene over again was also common practice, with the child as arbiter. I want to see her fall off the horse again. The movie theaters of the era were rightly called palaces. The lush dream of romance and adventure in faraway places began when we bought our tickets from a cashier seated in an ornate box modeled on a Turkish caliph's sedan chair. Inside, the theater was an opulent cave with thick carpeting and a sweeping marble staircase leading to the balcony. The walls of the auditorium were covered in plush brocade. I remember pushing my small fist against it and marveling that it yielded like a pillow. The brocade was shot with gilded thread, in whose whirls I saw other pictorial dramas of my own imagining. A pirate, a lady in a big hat, a prancing horse, just as I did when I lay in bed at home and looked up at the paintbrush marks on the ceiling. But these images were more ingratiating because they emerged from luxuriant silk instead of plain white plaster. When the movie ended and the soft amber lights came up, the magic remained. No one moved for a moment. Staying seated quietly in the cool penumbra was a gentle transition the audience could not resist. Finally, with what seemed like a collective sigh, people rose and walked slowly up the aisle, stumbling a little from the combined effects of the spongy carpet and the lingering days of enchantment. The spell was not broken until we left the theater and emerged onto the street. My first attack of depression came on a sizzling afternoon in September. What struck me was the contrast, the unbearably sudden contrast, between dark and light, between air-conditioned chill and heat-baked sidewalks, between the storybook vistas of the movie just seen and the stark reality of a tawdry, noisy 14th Street. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to cry, but I didn't dare. I knew from experience what would happen. My combative mother would have jumped to her favorite conclusion and demanded, "Did somebody at school pick on you? Why didn't you beat the shit out of them?" While Mama was getting all worked up, Granny, who wanted me to be a delicate Southern lady, would have chimed in with, "The child isn't well." It was easier to keep my troubles to myself, so I did. The depression receded once we got home and back into our usual routine, but the memory of it remained with me. I kept thinking about the contrast, which I called the different. Not the different light or the different temperature, just the different, as in a Stephen King title. Over the next several weeks, it happened each time we left the theater. Although I managed not to cry on the street, ultimately I did something worse. I broke down in the crowded ladies' lounge of the Tivoli. Many years later, when I went to Versailles, all I could think of was the ladies' lounge. They were furnished the same way. Louis Quinze chairs, tables and settees, ornate gilded mirrors, curlicued gilded frames containing pictures of Fragonard courtiers chasing nymphs through sylvan glades. But the lounge contained something that Versailles did not: ashtrays. Tall, tubular, stainless steel receptacles like umbrella stands, filled with sand and stuck with lipstick-smeared butts. There was one beside each Louis Quinze settee. The contrast between the modern, gleaming steel containers and the kind of furniture I had so often seen in costume movies was too much. Past and present, reality and fantasy, movie and life were side by side, next to each other, touching. I started crying. "What's the matter?" asked Granny. "Jesus Christ on roller skates." Mama, of course. "Oh, the poor little thing," some woman quavered. "Did the movie scare you, honey?" asked another. "It's those cartoons," said a third. "They're supposed to be funny, but everybody gets run over by steamrollers." "Did somebody at school pick on you?" "The poor little thing. She reminds me of Margaret O'Brien in that movie. Oh, what was the name of that? You remember, when she cried and cried and cried?" "What's the matter?" Granny asked again. "I don't know," I sobbed. "It's the different." "What's different?" "The ashtrays. They make me sad. I can't stand them." "Jesus Christ on roller skates. Who do you think you are, Greta Garbo?" Despite the stark reality I was pumping into the atmosphere, even my down-to-earth mother drew on the movies for her shouted analogy. The woman across the lounge was still more captive to fantasy. She had forgotten all about me and was back in the Margaret O'Brien movie. It was about the war, and she was an orphan in London, and Robert Young wanted to adopt her, but something happened that he couldn't, and then she just started crying and crying and crying. She wore a little peaked cap like a gremlin and wouldn't let go of her telescope. And I think somebody died. Was it Loretta Young? Anyhow, she just kept crying and crying and crying like her poor little heart would break. Oh, what was the name of that? "The child isn't well," Granny decreed. On that note, we left. By the time we got home, she had remembered a distant cousin who was never well and spent the rest of the evening sighing. It runs in the family. I had to spend the rest of the evening convincing Mama that nobody had picked on me. Maybe it was knowing that I had played into their hands that helped me pull myself together. Maybe my public crying jag had drained me of pity and terror. Maybe children are emotionally resilient. Or maybe it was simply that because I loathed Margaret O'Brien. For whatever reason, the different never returned after that. Everyone quickly forgot about it. Mama shrugged it off with her all-purpose explanation. "You're deep, just like your father." And Granny shortly got interested in something else that ran in the family. For my part, ever eager to dissociate myself from the genus children, and fiercely proud of pups like mature for her age and beyond her years that my teachers wrote on my report cards, I decided that the different was the last vestige of childhood, the emotional counterpart of my last skinned knee. I was wrong. It came back again and again throughout my life. albeit in subtler ways. Nor did I suffer alone. The different is America's eternal, universal emotion. It stays with us for life and attacks everybody except the Amish, because the only way to avoid it is never to go to the movies. My childhood version of the different was like Emily Dickinson's certain slant of light, a simple revulsion against abrupt contrast. Being a city child who wanted to live in a country house like the ones in Wuthering Heights and Kings Row, the grinding streetcars and sun-baked sidewalks were sudden, unbearable reminders of where I did live. Later, as an adult, I came to like cities, but by then I was susceptible to another kind of post-movie depression. There is more sexism in a year's worth of movies than actually exists in a woman's entire lifetime. The movies of the 50s and early 60s were constant reminders that every inclination I had was wrong. Close-ups of babies had to be greeted with aw and not the ugh I was thinking. The contemptuous hoots that greeted the sexually erring woman and the casting office spinster in horn-rimmed glasses filled me with angry confusion. In a contrary way, I wanted to be both women, and somehow I sensed that I would be both. Countless scripts called for the female star to deliver some version of the ringing line, "I just want to be a woman." When Eleanor Parker, as opera star Marjorie Lawrence, gave up her career to marry Glenn Ford, silencing his protests with, "I've had all that. I just want to be Mrs. Thomas King," the audience burst into applause that sent me into a cringing sulk. By the time the show was over, I felt like a stainless steel ashtray next to a Louis Quinn's settee. Instead of suffering from the different, I had become it. The post-movie mood is more often than not a bad one. How many arguments have you had or heard on leaving the theater? The young woman suddenly snaps at her date after spending 2 hours with Charlton Heston or Robert Redford. The husband, still under the spell of the French Foreign Legion, suddenly yells at the wife and kids who are keeping him from his life of adventure. The child emerging from My Friend Flicka gets slapped because he keeps whining, "Why can't we go live on a ranch?" The wife who has just seen Gaslight goes wild when her husband says he can't find the car keys, and the two middle-aged women who have just seen Mildred Pierce together can't wait to get home and give their daughters hell. Mama and I had an awful fight the night we went to see To Catch a Thief. I was then about the same age as the Grace Kelly character. I smelled trouble during the show when Jessie Royce Landis, who played Kelly's Rip Snorton mother, said, "My daughter's ashamed of me." My own Rip Snorton mother grunted and leaned as far away from me as she could get, so what happened later in the parking lot came as no surprise. "I guess you're ashamed of me, huh? Because I don't speak French, huh? Shit on French," she bellowed, banging her fist on the hood. "Shit on you. I'm as good as you are, you little snot, so take your French and shove it." Some people, a few cars away, burst into applause. It was what screenwriters aim for. Mama had identified with a character. I had not. I didn't like Grace Kelly, but I did identify with one of her lines. "The only difference between mother and me is a little grammar." I found it very touching because it was a perfect description of Mama and me, but when I tried to tell her this, she refused to believe it. A movie had come between us, and I wondered how many others had. What did she feel when she saw Stella Dallas? Did that hurt her too? I like to imagine how pleasant and confident life would be if movies had never been invented. An insignificant mishap like a crumbled wine cork would not make a man feel like an unsophisticated clod because he never would have seen Cary Grant extract one with a single adroit twist. With no one to imitate, everyone would have his own bona fide personality, and it would be a stronger one for being real. We would not be burdened with our current crisis in self-esteem because untold millions of people would not have spent the last 7 decades walking off into the night brooding. If only I could look like that dance like that, swim like that. And we would be free of the kind of sheer idiocy that makes people set their hearts on owning a car whose doors close with a whooshy snick because it's the rich car door sound they heard in movies. Whenever I speculate on what women would be like had movies never been invented, I need look no further than Granny. 36 in 1915, when Birth of a Nation and Theda Bara's A Fool There Was inaugurated the movie era, her personality was formed long before Hollywood encouraged women to exchange identity for identification. By the time I knew her, she got to the movies at least twice a week. But the movies never got to her. Her favorite scenes involved sickbeds and terminal illnesses, but her reaction was that of a technical advisor rather than a hypnotized spectator in the throes of romantic masochism. Old enough and rural enough to have witnessed real home deaths from a variety of grim causes, she was unimpressed when Jennifer Jones swallowed arsenic in Madame Bovary. "You never look that pretty when you're full of arsenic," she whispered to me. I'll never forget the time Willie Codrick swallowed that rat poison. He was spewing like a fountain from both ends. Obsessive loved moved her not. "The worse you treat a man, the better he treats you," she whispered during Letter from an Unknown Woman. "The man should be the one who's in love," she advised throughout Back Street. Equally lost on her were hankering dissatisfaction and hopeless yearning. Her resolute commitment was never more in evidence than when we went to see Betty Davis in Beyond the Forest. There was Davis as nostril-flaring Rosa Moline, married to good, dull Joseph Cotton, stuck in a small town and a shabby house, what a dump, that she hates. Consumed by the desire to run away to Chicago, her eyes stretch open every time she hears the train whistle. Bosom heaving in frustration, she gazes in the direction of Chicago, and then paces like a caged animal, while the background music plays Chicago, Chicago. Finding herself pregnant, she throws herself down a hill to get rid of the baby, who is keeping her from fleeing to Chicago. Dying of blood poisoning from the botched miscarriage, she drags herself out of bed and crawls on her hands and knees through the town to the railroad station while the background music plays a labored version of Chicago, Chicago as she collapses on the platform and claws the air. The Chicago train pulls in and momentarily hides her from view. When it pulls out again, we see her lying dead as the background music plays Chicago, Chicago in a funeral march time. The women seated around us were clutching their throats and moaning, "Oh, no, no." Mama was sitting forward in her seat, and I, too young to appreciate Rosa's problems, but knowing real tragedy when I saw it, was drooling soggy popcorn from a corner of my open mouth. "Why would anybody want to go to Chicago?" Granny asked irritably. "It's full of Yankees." This ends the reading.